Our moderator is Dr. Luis Inoa. Luis serves as the Associate Dean of the College in Student Living and Wellness at Vassar College and as the Anti-Racism Initiatives Director on the ACUHO-I Executive Board. Luis?
Good day, all. Again, my name is Luis Jimenez Inoa. I use he, him, his pronouns. Before having the presenters, which I'm honored to share today, to share this particular platform, introduce themselves, I thought it was important to acknowledge that no matter the platform, that we are still on Native land. The following is a statement inspired by Selena Su, political science professor at Brooklyn College. And it's one of her land acknowledgement statements. So that I've grown up a settler on indigenous land. This country, our institutions are built on a protracted process of dispossession, stolen land and stolen labor of indigenous peoples, enslaved African people, and the stolen lives of prior generations of immigrants. These are not just episodes in our history books, but ongoing structures that serve as a function for our social and economic conditions and environmental destruction today. Our institutions have benefited from this history and structure. In the words of Yuri Kochiyama, today our ultimate objective in learning about anything is to try to create and develop a more just society. But today our aim is to work towards a more just world for East Asian, Southeast Asian, Pacific Islander, and Desi American peoples. Kim and Sumi, again, I am honored to share this particular space with you. I want to acknowledge that what has brought us together is tragedy and ongoing anti-Asian violence and hate. I want to acknowledge you and your labor in this moment and time. To my colleagues here with us, I want to be clear that your attendance at this webinar is not the work. Your attendance here today is a pledge to take what you learn here and make the necessary efforts and changes in your respective campuses and communities. This is the way to honor those lost, suffering, and the labor of our presenters today. Kim, Sumi, please introduce yourselves, your names, pronouns if you choose, what you do, and if you can, in the spirit of civil rights activist Vincent Hardy, if you can, would you, who would say that all learning requires a measured level of intimacy, could you also bring into this space, by naming them, someone whose kindness and love inspires you? And Sumi, it looks like you're unmuted, so maybe you can go first.
I did the cardinal sin of unmuting too early. All right, Luis. Luis, thank you so much for the generous introduction for all of us, for the land acknowledgement, and for also naming what brought all of us here together today, which of course is tragedy and pain, which is a fresh tragedy and pain, but also historic tragedy and pain. And of course, a big focus of our work together today in this tight hour that we're gonna have is also about what can you, each one of you, David, Marcella, Lakendra, Peter, et cetera, do on your respective campus environments to continue to move the needle forward on justice, inclusion, racial equity for all of our communities. Today, of course, focused in on Asian American communities. My name is Suman Pendikur. Dr. P, that's what my students sometimes call me. I consider that my academic gangster name. I came up through the field originally through student affairs, working in Asian American and Pacific Islander student affairs. Eventually, after my doctorate, became a chief diversity officer at a STEM institution, went on from there to become the chief learning officer at the USC Race and Equity Center, and most recently left that role in this fall, in October, to become an independent diversity, equity, and inclusion strategist and consultant and speaker. It's been a very exciting journey. I also serve on the board of directors for NADOHE, the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, and it's an organization I'm really proud to serve with. I'm a mom of two, an 8-year-old and a 2-year-old. So you also asked, and my pronouns, of course, she, her, hers. You asked Luis, who has demonstrated love and kindness in our lives, and I think probably many people will come with the same answer, but the immediate person that came into my mind, especially because I just gotten off the phone with her before coming to join all of you, is my mom. My mom, who is an immigrant, learned English after coming to this country, has struggled in so many of her own ways, and has also consistently role modeled love and care and learning over the lifespan, and has continued to be a role model for me in everything I do. So thank you for that wonderful framing you afforded us, Luis. Pass it over to Kim.
Thanks, Sumi. My name is Kim June. My gender pronouns are she, her, hers, they, them, theirs. I'm currently Executive Director of Justice, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion at MGH Institute of Health Professions. I think my background has been focused on racism and racial trauma. Before that, my work has been focused on college access and student success until I experienced racism in higher education and was politicized into engaging in this work. Just in terms of thinking about somebody that I bring who supported me during my undergraduate years was Bob Maeda. I'm a first-gen college student. My mom has a sixth grade education. My dad has a ninth grade education. I grew up low income, and I had a really hard time transitioning from high school to college. I also did not learn about Asian American history in my K-12 education, didn't have that opportunity in higher education. And the only way that I could do that was through studying Asian art. And Bob was one of my mentors. And he also, when he was younger, was incarcerated in Boston and Arizona. And so I just think about him and his support of me to be able to navigate through like my doctoral program. He wrote my letters of recommendation and he supported me. So I bring him to this space.
Thank you both. We're going to be doing a teach-in first. So there'll be a couple of presentations, and then we'll take some questions after this. Prior to jumping into those presentations, we're going to do a quick poll to get a sense for what we've been doing on our own campuses in relation to addressing and supporting our students, Asian American students on our campuses. So we have a couple of things here. I think part of it is try to get a sense for, ideally beyond the statements, which are nice and necessary. We know we have to do more. All right, we'll get some of those poll results up in a little bit. But Dr. P, if you want to go ahead and start us off, that'd be great.
You got it. Let's see. I think I'm going to need the share screen feature turned on. It says I can't share screen while the other participants sharing. So, okay, perfect. I think we're in. One moment, folks. All right. Can I just get a thumbs up from folks? Are you able to see the slide deck? All right, fantastic. Now, I also want to make sure that folks, you have the chat open so that you can write to each other and write to me. And I believe if you just click the everyone, you'll be able to write to everyone. So if you have comments or thoughts at any point where I'm speaking, please put it into the chat. I'm going to try to keep track of it as best as I can. And I know Luis will be doing the same. So if there's anything we can drill down in or hone in on, that we can do that with you and for you. So again, really delighted to be here today. And I wanted a term, my little, everything, first of all, that Kim and I are going to talk about today, we could spend months, if not years, talking about. NADOHE and ACUHO-I have said you get an hour. So in the next, approximately 14.75 minutes, I'm going to attempt to squish in Asian American History 101, just so that, again, we're leveling the playing field, because going back to what Kim said, and you can all do this little thought exercise, think back to what you learned about Asian history, Asian American history specifically, and the Asian American experience in your K through 12 years. And if you okay, I'm unmuting myself. If you think back to your own kindergarten through 12th grade experience, and you think about what was it you actually learned about Asians in America, maybe a few things come to mind. You can put in the chat whatever it was that you did learn. Jeanette's like, nah, there was really not much. Maybe you learned about Chinese railroad workers. Maybe you learned about the internment and incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. Maybe you learned about Michelle Kwan. Maybe, right? Like you learned a couple of key celebrity historical figures and a couple of key moments. It looks like the host is sharing poll results. So I'll pause. And it appears that based on the poll results, that 84% of your campuses issued a statement, 67% offered some kind of supportive space for community dialogue, And then it is just a sharp dip from there. Can everyone see these poll results up on the screen right now? Or is it just me? Peter's saying yes. Okay. Look at this. Allocated additional funding, 2%. Invested in Asian American Studies program, 2%. Increased the recruitment and hiring of Asian faculty and staff, 3%. Other, 14%. My institution hasn't taken any steps, 7%. So I'm going to actually take a screenshot of that because I think that is a fascinating data point. And I think you should too. If you're trying to take this back to your campuses and advocate for additional resources, show this because this is something pretty terrible. I'm going to go ahead and close mine now. Okay, so we're talking about what it was you actually saw, learned, knew, or observed. And of course, it's multifaceted, right? Less than 1% of K-12 school teachers in the United States are of Asian descent. Severely underrepresented. Approximately 96% of American school teachers are white women. So very, very small percentage of that pie. So both from the teaching end and from what is being taught end, the question of invisibility kind of is embedded in all of that, right? So I want to talk about Asian American on the razor's edge because I want to complicate that narrative of invisibility just a little bit. Also just want to introduce myself. So if any of you want to stay in touch, because again, we have such a tight time together today, that if you'd want to follow up afterwards, you want additional resources, you want to have a conversation, those are all the ways you can find me. I am not cool enough for TikTok yet, but if I ever make it there, I will let you know. But here are all the other ways that you can find me or get in touch. Luis, I think, did a great job of centering why we're here together today. But I do want to take 1 minute to breathe into our space together. All of us are rushing from Zoom to Zoom to Zoom to Zoom all day. And there is very little space in those days. When we went to our campuses and our offices, we would at least have time to go pee or get a snack. Now, sometimes it doesn't even feel like that, if I'm being really blunt, right? So if you'll join me just for 1 second to choose to honor why we're here and to center why we're here in a moment of breath. We have, since a year ago now, seen a sharp uptick in the violence against people perceived as Asian and Asian American, particularly elders, particularly women, particularly those who are low income and vulnerable, those who are doing collection from trash cans of bottles and cans. So folks who are at the margins already, elderly, vulnerable, women, low wage, massage workers, folks on the street. And of course, we've not only had the violence uptick, and many of you have seen those videos, right? Have you been seeing those videos across your social media of Asian elders literally being beaten or boot stomped in the street? And it is vicious and ugly and cruel, right? When people can simply not even be seen as human anymore. And of course, this crosses many of our communities of color and our minoritized communities, these experiences. But most recently, of course, after Lunar New Year of this year, we had the murders in Atlanta of multiple women working in massage parlors. We had the murders of 6 Indian Sikhs at the FedEx plant in Indianapolis, Indiana. We've had multiple murders of Asians in this last week alone. Some of which is not making the national news, so you may not be covering it. So if you're willing to do this with me, to simply just take in a breath collectively and to release it in honor of the whole reason we're here. And we're simply going to take in a breath for 4, hold it for 4, release that breath for 4, and then hold the release for 4, and then go into our time together. So here we go. Thank you for breathing into our community with me. And like any of us, particularly those of you who are joining today who happen to be of Asian descent, who do identify as Asian American, you are here to both gain skills and tools and knowledge to continue to work on your campuses, and you are also subject and object of the work. You are holding the pain of our communities at this time. So in particular, I see you and I honor you. This happens to all of us, right? Any of us who are experiencing the harm of a society and then asked to do that work in our respective environments are holding this double subjectivity, which can make it difficult. So let me frame a couple of different thoughts, okay? First of all, Asian Americans. I love this quote by Jane Jun, and I cannot recommend this particular reading enough. Jane Jun, From Coolies to Model Minorities, from 2007. And maybe, Luis, if you can throw that citation into the chat. Jun, Coolies to Model Minorities, 2007. And what political scientist Jane Jun did is tracked, as many other social scientists have done, the evolution of Asian American identity in this country from the late 1700s and early 1800s all the way through the 1960s and 1970s, and how that identity transformed over decades and over centuries. But she writes in there that any study of the politics of identity must therefore be informed by a careful examination of the context of racial hierarchy and its relationship to state policies. So one core factor that we have to be able to grapple with in our critical understanding of Asian American identity is that Asian American racial identity is not simply being Asian in America. It is in particular how Asian American racial identity has been shaped and formed by the twin needs of the twin prongs of US labor needs and US foreign policy interests. So what we see over the couple hundred years of Asian history in this country is that depending on what the US's labor needs were at any given time, they selected specific types of labor to serve those needs, whether it was Chinese plantation labor, Japanese railroad workers, et cetera, Sikh farmers. And at the same time, depending on which Asian nations the US was invading or attempting to colonize at any given time, various acts were put into place about Asians. So almost as soon as you see the growth of a Chinese community here in the United States, you see the passage of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Right? So Asians are the single largest community that have had multiple exclusion acts placed against them from 1875 onwards. And I want to be really specific about that 1875 one because it's critical for our understanding of what happened in Atlanta in particular, right? So here, this triangulation is critical that Asians have been positioned vis-a-vis US labor needs and US foreign policy interests, whether we're thinking about the incursions into Vietnam and the invasion of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and what that resulted in terms of traumatized migrant communities and refugee communities, or the plucking of labor from China, Japan, Korea, India, et cetera, to fulfill the US's westward expansion, right? Manifest Destiny, which of course at the same time was cannibalizing native land, putting native people into reservations while using enslaved African labor to fulfill the sort of insatiable need for capital in this country, okay? So let's hold those two together. And I want to offer a couple of images, some of which may be familiar to you. You see that we have Chinese laborers here working on the railroad, most often left out of so much of the historical record and the photographs of when we think about who built the railroad, but they were a tremendous force in building the railroad. But let me pause there for a second. I mentioned the 1875 Act, and this was called the Page Act, which very specifically prohibited Chinese women from coming to the United States for a number of reasons. One, to prevent Chinese men and Chinese women from actually being able to be together and to make families and to be able to stay here, right? To have a displaced temporary workforce that they could kick out at any time. And you, in your own mind, make the connections between what the US did to Chinese laborers and what they did to Mexicans, for example, vis-a-vis the Braceros program, right? These are trends in how the US has treated its global labor workforce. But the exclusion of Asian women was specifically positioned as, we don't want Chinese women because they're all prostitutes and they'll bring sexual diseases here. So the underlying thread of harm and violence against Asian women in the 1875 Act has echoes to how the women were murdered at the massage parlors in Atlanta. None of these can be disconnected from each other. Martha, absolutely bringing up here, thinking about US militarism in the Philippines on the chat in the Spanish-American War too, right? That the US went in as quote unquote liberators and then ended up colonizing the Philippines as the new imperial overlords. Now, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which I mentioned to you, passed in 1882, was the most restrictive immigration act, banning all Chinese, and it eventually was followed by a range of exclusion acts targeting various Asian communities. Japanese, Korean, Indian, followed by a total ban on Asian immigration in 1924. This is a political cartoon from 1886 depicting the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the whole purpose of this particular political cartoon was to promote this company's washing machine. So let's get these quote unquote Chinamen out of here and you can purchase our washing machine so it can do your labor. This is a key part of that racial triangulation that I talked about with you, right? Which Omi and Wynot described so well. Propagating violence while solidifying racial warfare amongst workers has been a key tactic. So as I mentioned, Omi and Wynot, scholars who study racial formation theory, they write, a racial project is simultaneously an interpretation, representation, or an explanation of racial dynamics in an effort to reorganize and redistribute resources along particular racial lines. And so you can think about that. You think about how white labor has been positioned and how, in fact, immigrant white people were then renamed as white, right? How the Irish were not originally white, how Italians were not originally white, were brought into the project of whiteness in order to be positioned against Chinese labor, Black labor, Mexican labor, Latin labor, etc. And so you see here the specter of, it literally says here, the yellow peril, the Asian boogeyman, the Chinese boogeyman that will take jobs from real American workers. And part of this, the pitting of labor against each other, is part of this core of racial triangulation. Okay, so that's premise number one. And I also want to mention premise number two, racial triangulation part two, particularly in relationship to the Black-white binary in this country, right? The Black-white binary positions Asian Americans, whether we are East Asian, Southeast Asian, or South Asian, as forever foreigners, honorary whites, beneficiaries of anti-Black racism, on the treadmill to whiteness, right? And you visualize it. It's a wonderful writer who I adore named Vijay Prashad, who has a phenomenal book called The Karma of Brown Folk, written almost as a call and response to The Souls of Black Folk by W.B. Du Bois. And in there, he writes about Asians being on the treadmill to whiteness. And you imagine the treadmill, right? You never actually get there. But you think if you play the game, you keep your head down and you work hard enough, then maybe eventually achieve the promised land of whiteness, none of which is actually true, right? It goes back to communities being pitted against one another. So this Black-white binary is incredibly critical in our secondary understanding of Asians in this country. How they've been positioned and used, how we've been positioned and used vis-a-vis labor and foreign policy and imperialism. And then how we've been then positioned particularly against Black and other brown communities in a perpetual race to the bottom, right? Because if you're told, well, you're going to be rewarded for playing the game, well, then there's folks in our community who choose to play the game because that's what they've been taught, right? So this shift from laborers, dirty, vermin infested, opium eating, raping, etc., laborers, right, which were the broadest stereotypes of the time that justified, by the way, the lynchings of Chinese people up and down the West Coast in the 1800s and the early 1900s, shifted after 1965 to all of a sudden create the model minority myth. And so that's the other positioning. When we're talking about the positioning of Asian Americans, we need to pull apart how we're viewed as perpetual foreigners, not true Americans, therefore susceptible to violence and violation. And at the same time, how we are so fundamentally American that we worked hard, quote unquote, achieved the American dream, pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps, and therefore, why can't all you other minorities do it too? It's one of the dirtiest tricks, right, of any kind of colonial master, which is a divide and conquer strategy. 1965, I told you, 1924 was the All Asian Exclusion Act. Banned all Asians except for Filipinos because they were colonial subjects, were still laborers in US empire. 1965, though, after nearly 40 years of an Asian Exclusion Act, in between, of course, which 110,000 Japanese Americans were put in American concentration camps in World War II, 60% of whom were under age 12. 1965 was the Hart-Celler Immigration Act. And this is a huge moment, tipping point in Asian American history on some levels, because at that moment, you imagine what's happening in the mid-60s. Of course, there's civil rights agitation, Black people marching in the streets, communities across the country mobilizing, it's being televised. And it is also the height of the Cold War, the space race, and the USSR has pulled far ahead of the United States of America. So let us go back to that first premise about racial triangulation and labor needs. Where does the US choose to draw its labor from at that point? Its intellectual labor at this point is from Asia again. So this is when you move into preferential status immigration, all of a sudden opening up the gates, but now it's for Asians who'd want, instead of backbreaking labor, for intellectual labor, students, grad students, doctors, engineers, scientists, et cetera, et cetera. That is the bulk of the post-1965 immigration boom. My family is a direct beneficiary of that. My parents immigrated in 1969, 4 years after the Hart-Celler Immigration Act, sponsored by my eldest uncle who'd come to Canada in 1959. But this is why the mythology, the model minority myth, is also so deeply pernicious, because it didn't just come out naturally, it was a cultivated myth. In 1966, two major publications, the US News and World Report and the Wall Street Journal, both run articles, one about the Chinese and one about the Japanese in America, talking about how, look at these Chinese, look at these Japanese, look how hard they're working, look how they're building up their communities, look how they're being positioned against, specifically and in particular, against Black people agitating for civil rights and equal rights and human rights in this country. The message, of course, being these are quote unquote good minorities, those are bad minorities. And of course, there is a deep class analysis here, right? That the social capital and economic capital, even if, for example, my parents, like most immigrants at that time, came with 2 suitcases and $8 each. That's exactly what they were allowed to come with. So they didn't come with a lot of money, but they did come with the resources to build connections and then eventually to work jobs and to get an education, et cetera. The model minority myth is a cultivated myth about who was chosen and allowed to immigrate and the children of those immigrants who are beneficiaries of the intellectual and social capital of those who are allowed to immigrate. We're not talking about the folks who were children of the Chinese laborers in the 1850s. We're talking about this class of folks post-1965. And of course, this all becomes complicated post-1975 and refugee waves, which Kim is going to talk about, particularly when we need to focus on disaggregating data. But I can't emphasize this point enough, that the creation of this model minority myth has been harmful for multiple communities. One, harmful for other Black and Brown communities who get pitted against our community, and deeply harmful for our community because it puts us in a box. It puts us in a performance box. And if you don't fulfill the tropes of the model minority, then where do you fit in? There's no place for you. And our counseling centers on college campuses are full of students who don't fit that box and that trope, which, by the way, renders communities invisible, masks the problems we do have inside our community on so many different levels, and we get used as a wedge tool against each other. So in this context, I called it the razor's edge of being triangulated in multiple harmful ways. How do we walk that edge to advocate for ourselves and for our communities without falling into racial pitfalls, without falling into the crabs in a bucket mentality in which I'm going to get mine, but screw everybody else? So I wanted to offer this, and I'm going to turn it over to Kim in about 3 minutes here. The demand and the necessity for each one of you, Jeanette and Peter and Danae and Mary and Cheryl and Michelle and Martha and Sherwood, the necessity for each and every one of you who is here today to become historians and sociologists of the Asian American experience, in the same way that we need to be historians and sociologists of the Black experience, of the Latinx experience, of the Indigenous and Native and First Nations experience, of the Arab and Middle Eastern experience, of the white experience. Fundamentally, our educational systems on so many levels, even in the collegiate environment, have failed us. And so what is the need and the desire for each one of you as practitioners, as faculty, as staff, as administrators, to actually have a more critical understanding of counter-narrative history, of understanding Asian Americans, how they've been positioned, of seeing Asian Americans as this immensely complex community of nearly 60 different ethnicities under this powerful socio-political umbrella of shared experiences, but without masking the need to disaggregate, again, which Kim's going to talk about. And it brings us, of course, to today, right? In this kind of, I made this kind of game shape here, or this snake-like shape here, that if we don't know who Chin, Lee, and Sodhi are, then we miss part of the Asian American narrative of Asian Americans as perpetual foreigners, positioned as outsiders, vulnerable to the same brutal tactics that the US nation state uses against other minoritized and marginalized communities. And we also miss the opportunity to build coalitions of solidarity and to have more critical understandings of what's happening on our campuses, right? This is why statements aren't enough. If you don't have Asian American studies on your campus, you've got a gap, you've got an opportunity. Now, I know Kim's going to dive more deeply into this, but I will say, just in terms of concrete pieces, and we'll talk about this more in a little bit, concrete pieces that affects each and every single one of you who are joining us here today, pulling apart your data, figuring out how model minority lenses are being used to close out Asian Americans in your admissions and enrollment process, in your financial aid process. How are your Southeast Asian students viewed versus and differently than your East Asian students versus your South Asian students? How are your Indian American students viewed differently than your Bangladeshi or Pakistani or Sri Lankan students, right? We can get nuanced here. And throughout everything, academic and career advising, are you using white normative lenses to engage in your advising practices? Do you actually have counseling staff in your counseling and psychological services centers on campus who are not just trained in multicultural counseling, but actually have some skill and ability to work with the complexity of Asian American experiences? I know we've got a lot of friends here from ACUHO-I today, so across residential life, again, coming up from student affairs, one of the most critical places for people to actually learn about one another, particularly when our educational systems have kept that from each other. And that, to me, where I sit, I see that as a very deliberate tool and choice of a white supremacist educational system, that we don't get to learn enough about each other in order to find a path forward. And of course, hiring. If I looked at your campus and I came to your campus, Peter or Jeanette or Jalyn, and I looked at what was going on, would I see a racial hierarchy in the pyramid of who works on your campus, who teaches on your campus, who serves people on your campus, and who leads your campus? Would that what I would see? I would ask all of those questions. So I will stop there to turn it over. Let me stop my share. And I'm going to bump it over to Luis and Kim and be quiet.
Thank you so much, Sumi. I feel like you've covered a lot of the stuff that I was planning on covering. So I will share my screen and go through what I have in terms of the slides. So I'll be introducing some information about Asian Americans, provide examples of how we've experienced racism in our society and in higher education, as well as share resources with you, because I think a lot of you are also sharing it in the chat, which I think is great too, and discuss implications. So we know that Asian Americans make up 5.4% of the population, which is kind of small, right? And we know, like, we have all of these terms to describe them. Asian American, APIA, API, APIDIA, APA, AAPI, but all of them pretty much describe this large group that has some connection to Asia, right? So we're treated as a monolithic group. And so to talk a little bit more about racism, I'm using this definition of racism, which is by Shelley Harrell. It's a system of dominance, power, and privilege based on racial group designations rooted in historical oppression, which I think Sumi did a really good job of helping us to better understand how Asian Americans have experienced racism historically, occurring in circumstances where members of the dominant group create, accept societal privilege by maintaining structures, ideology, values, and behavior that have the intent or effect of leaving non-dominant groups relatively excluded from power, esteem, status, and or equal access to societal resources. And again, Sumi talked about the model minority myth and how that confuses individuals about how Asian Americans experience racism. So Sumi talked a little bit about this too, how South Asians have not been included as much in the conversations when it comes to Asian Americans, and they should be included. We should also talk about anti-Muslim discrimination and racism. So the Muslim Justice League does work on countering violent extremism, which is a campaign driven by national security. So it's a policy that's providing grant funding, but it actually just increases hyper surveillance of Muslim communities in the US. And so these are two examples of the ways in which Asian Americans experience racism in our society that we haven't talked about as a larger group when we talk about anti-Asian racism that's recent. And another form of anti-Asian violence is how Southeast Asians have been deported. And it's been an ongoing process. And a lot of folks are refugees from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. They came here as refugees. They might not even have a connection to their homelands, and they might not even be speaking their language. So for more information about this, you can go to these community organizations who are engaging in this work. Sue et al. In 2007 published an article about how Asian Americans experience microaggressions. And there were 9 different themes. The first is the perpetual foreigner, which Sumi covered, as well as the model minority myth. The third is denial of racial reality, meaning that we're not seen as people of color. 4, exoticization of Asian American women. I would also argue desexualization of Asian American men. And we've seen that in the shootings that happened recently. Invalidation of interethnic differences. So just assuming that Asians are just Chinese, or just like that is exactly what people think of when I just talked about the ways in which we're very diverse, pathologizing cultural values, communication styles, second-class citizenship, and not being treated like others, invisibility, and then there were just underdeveloped incidents and responses, which I think they probably didn't reach saturation for those of you who are in research. So for me, what I see is this process of like having that model minority myth turns into the denial of our racial reality, and then invalidation of our interethnic differences, which in turn renders us invisible as a community. So when we're looking at the data on Asian Americans, especially when it comes to educational attainment, we know 1 in 2 Asian Americans have bachelor's degrees, and this is higher compared to 1 in 3 Americans and 1 in 5 Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. And I pulled up, there's several of these charts that I'm pulling up and going through, but you could also see them if you go to aapidata.com to learn more about this information, because it's really important for us to disaggregate data. I did this work several years ago, and one of my managers didn't understand how it was related to DEI or how it was related to racial justice, and it is definitely related, and is so when we look at the total population, 29.8% of the American population has a BA or higher, and we see disparities that exist too among Black, Latinx, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander alone, as well as American Indian and Alaska Natives. Their rates are lower. And when you disaggregate data, you're also seeing that Vietnamese, Burmese, Cambodian, Hmong, Laotian, Bhutanese, they all have lower educational attainment rates. And when we think about how they came to the US, a lot of them were refugees, and they're also the ones that are more likely to be deported at the moment as well too. And so when we're looking at the mean of how Asian Americans are doing in higher education, they look like they're doing great. So there is no special attention paid to Southeast Asian populations when it comes to admissions, when it comes to financial aid policies and retention. And when we also look at the data on those who have less than a high school education within the US, we see that the total population has 13.3%. And I think here you even see that Asian Americans alone have 14% less than high school educational attainment rates. And again, you're seeing this same trend of Southeast Asians and also like Chinese individuals too, like 17.1% of all Chinese individuals in this country have less than high school education. And these are some things that we never talk about. And it's so important that we do, because when we talk about affirmative action, I think that Southeast Asians and Dalits as well should be included in these conversations. And again, when we're looking at those living below poverty line, we're seeing the same trends happen where the total population, like 15.5% of the total population in the US lives below poverty. But when we disaggregate the data, we see Pakistani, Laotian, Cambodian, Malaysian, Bangladeshi, Mongolian, Hmong, and Nepalese communities have overrepresentation or more than the national average. And we don't think about them when we talk about data and the importance of data. So we see this like bimodal distribution across the Asian American diaspora, but we don't talk about it because we're always looking at the mean and how Asians seem to be doing well, which leads us to ask questions like, are Asian Americans white or are they people of color? And I've been on so many different panels where I've talked about this very topic. And it was only until recently with Atlanta that now people recognize that Asian Americans experience racism when all along we've been experiencing it for hundreds of years, right? So we look at these, I don't know if you remember this, but on the left, the Associated Press during Katrina, this came out where phenotypically this Black child during Katrina was described as looting, and phenotypically white 2 individuals were seen as finding. We were told that the lower 9th ward was 70% Black. We didn't know what the 30% was, and they never told us what it was. But if you watched a village called Versailles, we found, like, you would know that they were Vietnamese, and a lot of them were Vietnamese and Cambodian, again, like refugees. And we were quick to call out racism in the media, but do we call out invisibility when we don't know that Asian Americans don't appear in this conversation at all when we're talking about communities of color and oppression? Also, after Katrina, and 5 years after Katrina, there was a BP oil spill, and we didn't see this in the media at all, but Vietnamese and Cambodian fishermen, as well as shrimpers, were the hardest hit after the BP oil spill. They didn't have language access to the different forms and all of the things that were going on there. I had to pull this article from the Christian Science Monitor because it wasn't in any of the media other than, I think, 5 years later in NBC News. So I've been looking for information about it since then, and there hasn't been any information about what's going on within the Southeast Asian community in New Orleans. So they were hit during Katrina, and didn't have as much support or targeted support, didn't have access to translations, and then also with the BP oil spill. So it's really important for us to think about how we disaggregate data, how we include Southeast Asians in conversations. And we see like the same things happening in higher education, right? So Asian Americans are often treated as a monolithic group and this model minority. Asian Americans are often grouped with whites when we look at the data on educational attainment. Like the research always groups Asians with whites, and it doesn't include Asian Americans in conversations about BIPOC students. When we talk about undocumented students, do we discuss how 1.7% or 1.7 million Asian Americans in the US are undocumented? When we have programs for URMs, do we include Asian Americans? Because NIH doesn't. When we discuss food insecurity, do we think about Asian American students? And when we talk about racial trauma, do we include Asian Americans? There has been very little to no targeted support for Asian American students. And we saw that in today's survey too, from the beginning, right? And I do want to show 2 quick data points on Asian Americans where as a monolithic group, you could see that we are represented, right? So Asian American young adults are the only racial group with suicide as their leading cause of death. So why is nobody talking about them? So for students who are between the ages of 15 and 24, that's the leading cause of death. This is true for no other racial group in this age range in America. And when you think about your college campuses, are you providing targeted support for them? I wanted to show this because it went viral in March, which was last month, where there were resources on anti-Asian racism, but what the resources actually did was perpetuate anti-Asian racism. And there had to be edits to the page of the resource. And finally, there was an apology that said, we ultimately we ultimately posted and included some insensitive and inappropriate content that we have now removed. So thinking about who you hire to support Asian Americans when it comes to mental health services, make sure that they are aware of the experiences that Asian Americans have when it comes to racism. Another data point that we know of, Asian Americans as an entire group, they're often left out of discussions about discrimination in the workplace because they're stereotyped as the model minority and they're doing well. But at the same time, they're the most least likely group in the US to be promoted to management positions. So it's extremely hard for Asian Americans to do this. And this is not true of any other race. It's Asian Americans that are the least likely. And so in thinking about implications for learning, reflection, and putting into practice, learn about the history of Asian Americans collectively, as well as ethnic subgroups, engage with community organizations that focus on Asian American activism and solidarity work and support them, recognize that Asian Americans are not a monolithic group and that they're people of color, and include them in these conversations, reflect on your own role in supporting or not supporting Asian Americans thus far, and where you will go from here. And finally, how to put it into action, disaggregate data, like Sumi had mentioned, use a JEDI lens. So I will copy and paste an article that I wrote, moving from DEI to JEDI and making sure that you are leading with justice and equity capacity build. So now that you know this information, how are you going to engage and help faculty, staff, and students on your college campuses to learn about this as well, to support Asian American studies, include Asian Americans in the discussions about policies when they're related to people of color as well as BIPOC folks on your campus. So for example, one policy or one thing that I just implemented on my campus was to recognize faculty of color and invisible labor, and Asian Americans are included in this conversation. Provide targeted support to Asian American students, especially mental health services, because we know mental health is really important considering the data that I just shared, but then also all of the racial trauma that's going on within our society, and hire qualified individuals who understand the experiences of racialized Asian American students, and then hire, support, retain, and develop career pathways for Asian Americans into leadership positions. I think that is all. This is my contact information. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have, and I will turn it back over to Luis.
Absolutely amazing work. Again, thank you for your labor, your thoughts, the care that both of you have put into the presentation, and the wisdom and information provided. Thank you. We have very limited time, so it'd be hard to, I think, to kind of get through the questions. I know that we, in our previous conversations, one of the most heartbreaking things for me, and so I think you started by kind of acknowledging the elderly Asian woman, Asian man who've been food stamped, and it's just heartbreaking to see another person of color doing that. And so wanted to talk a little bit about the impact of that kind of that horizontal violence, if you will, but also to not just simply lean on that. Right, the kind of the flip side of that is that, while the struggles might seem a bit disparate, they're not. Our fates are really tied together. And I'm wondering if there are a particular either moments in history or more recently where you have seen the collaboration, partnership, allyship between communities that has been essential to move us towards justice. So one of those two things, the impact of that horizontal violence, but also these particular reflections around allyship, partnership.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? Because it has been, I'll speak very personally, it's been deeply painful to see video after video of what appears to be majority Black men beating and boot stomping Asian elders. And we need to name it on its face for what it is and not shy away from what it is that we're visibly witnessing, right? Most recently, I saw one of a, elderly bottle collector getting beat down again by a Black man in the street. And this is a really painful part of the conversation. And a lot of folks are very uncomfortable having it because the immediate instinct is, well, let's not talk about it because you could veer into anti-Blackness. And we do have to be cautious to not veer into anti-Blackness, right? And how do we separate? And this is the skill we need to bring to these kinds of dialogues and discussions. How do we separate out these individual acts of horizontal violence and oppression from the systems and structures around people that have not allowed for mental health care, that have gentrified neighborhoods, that have taken jobs from people's neighborhoods, that have created inequitable systems of care, because all of those are actually embedded in that horrific moment of violence, right? So when we're looking at what's happening, whether it's in Chinatowns or on the street in New York or Philadelphia, the Uber driver, Muhammad Anwar, sole wage earner for his family, murdered by 2 Black teenage girls in his own Uber who tasered him to death. If we don't talk about the ugliness, it just sits there, right? And what happens is that it festers within communities to create more distance and more resentment, right? And so what I'm seeing, and maybe you're seeing this too from a lot of folks I'm working with, is there's no space to put that anxiety and tension and the need to talk about horizontal violence, because the immediate pivot is, well, it's white supremacy causing it. And it actually is. It fundamentally is, because the one of the core tools of white supremacy, to go back to the divide and conquer model, is that we are not taught to actually see one another as human beings in the deepest and most profound of ways, right? And so in the case of what you just brought up, Luis, of a Black man violating an Asian elder on the street, there is such a loss of humanity there that can be laid at the feet fundamentally of white supremacy, but we also have got to have space to talk about this. So one thing that I'm encouraging with the groups that I work with is create more spaces of Black Asian dialogue, because there actually needs to be cultivated and shaped and in containers that can hold whatever comes out of that, so it doesn't just end up in recrimination and screaming. Number 2, this is fundamentally the role of Asian American studies and Asian American and Pacific Islander student resources on college campuses that need additional resources to actually help people understand, where does this type of violence come from, and also to have the data-driven approach that Kim just shared with us. Because again, if we go back to the data, we actually know that the vast majority of violence perpetrated against Asians is still perpetrated by white people. So what shows up in our news feeds is both true, that this horizontal violence is occurring, and that it also propagates another narrative as if that's the only violence that is occurring, right? So what happened in Indiana and what happened in Atlanta, both perpetrated by white men, mass murders, we need to hold all of that to account. And the thing is that here in LA, at least, when there were solidarity vigils and gatherings, full of Black, brown, and Asian people, full of people on the street. So we don't need to go back to Grace Lee Boggs or Yuri Kochiyama cradling Malcolm X's head on her lap when he was murdered, right? We don't even need to go back there. We can go to today to see how Black, Asian, and other communities of color and white communities have been on the streets particularly since George Floyd was murdered. Every one of our cities across the country has had marches and rallies. And so if I'm going to pivoting to what I'm actually seeing in terms of allyship, there was not a march or rally in this country that you saw that was not multiracial across the board. Asians, Latinos, Black people, white people, in a way that I had not seen in recent years, right? And we go to all of them. We went to Day Without an Immigrant rallies for years and years here. We went to the Women's March. We go to every rally and march we can. We take the kids. And the level of multiraciality was actually really profoundly important to bear witness to, so that we don't get caught also in the narrative of pessimism and hopelessness, right? That there's nothing, and that this is just, white supremacy is too big and we can't do anything about it, right? So I don't know, I'll offer those thoughts, Luis, because that's a huge question you asked, and Kim will probably offer something more deep than I did.
Subi, I think you did a really great job answering the question. Luis, I ended up being in the chat, so I was wondering if you can repeat the question. Are you talking about just horizontal violence as well as just solidarity work? And I don't feel like I have as much to add to what Sumi had mentioned. I think it's just really important that for those of us who are a part of NADOHE and ACUHO-I, the education piece within our schools is really important. The commitment of resources to support Asian American studies and the education of folks within our colleges and universities to develop this common understanding of what racism is, and understand what systemic oppression is, right? And understand white supremacy. Because in our country, like racism is like the American Racial Project is one of white supremacy. So we should be having these conversations as well as the solidarity spaces that Sumi is talking about.
And fundamentally, the things that actually are ripping our communities apart are the things that our communities need, right? Housing, healthcare, mental health, community forms of policing versus the militarized police state that we have inflicted upon so many of our communities, right? Those are actually things across the board. So I will say this one thing, and for particularly any of my Asian American friends out there today, right? As we advocate for additional resources for Asian Americans, one of the things that I don't advocate for is additional policing. One, because it harms, for example, you saw what Kim shared about Southeast Asian youth who are products, by the way, of intergenerational trauma being shoveled into the jail pipeline and then being deported. That is part of the same criminalization and policing that affects Black communities and Latino communities as well, right? So policing is not the answer for the violence that's happening across and between communities. I just wanted to put that out there, something important.
Thank you both. You invited us to breathe and breathe into this space and invite us to do that once more. To take that deep breath for yourselves. Again, appreciating the care, the attention, the learning provided today. Quick closing with I've used this in a variety of other spaces because I'm enamored with Dr. Alexis Pauline Gumbs' work, Black activist, scholar, poet. But there's a piece called Wishful Thinking that she wrote collectively with Black women. And I just, in closing, just want to, for both Sumi and for Kim, to just share that today you've chosen to be part of association's work and to be in community that knows that you are priceless, that would never sacrifice your spirit, and that knows it needs your brilliance to be whole. That today you have spoken. I am hoping that we can say that we have listened and that we are so glad that you are here of all places. So my deepest appreciation for the work and the lifting that you both did today. And I'll turn it back to Holly.
A big thank you to Louis, Sumi, and Kimberly. Amazing session, lots of engagement in the chat. We got a couple questions from folks about the recording that will be available on the ACUHO-I YouTube channel by Monday. So we'll make sure that y'all know where that is. We'll send a message out to all registrants. On behalf of ACUHO-I and the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, we look forward to seeing you again soon in the virtual space. Thank you again for being with us. Take good care.